I sat at the end of the table, hands folded, eyes down. Lena didn't look at me. Victor cleared his throat. "Let's start," Lena said. "Time is money." One director asked, "Any final reports?" Victor smiled. "Just one concern." Lena nodded. "Say it." He glanced at me. "Some people here add no value." My heart jumped. I said nothing. Lena leaned back. "I agree." I looked up. "Lena?" She avoided my eyes. "This is business." I said, "I worked here for years." Victor said, "Worked or hid?" Someone laughed. I felt heat in my face. "I never asked for credit." Lena said, "That's the problem." I whispered, "What problem?" She said, "You're comfortable being small." The room went quiet. Victor pushed a folder toward her. "HR prepared this." She slid it to me. "Sign." I stared. "You're firing me?" She said, "I'm letting you go." I said, "In front of everyone?" She replied, "You should be grateful." My chest hurt. "For what?" "For the chance to leave with dignity." I laughed once. "Dignity?" Victor said, "Security will walk you out." I stood slowly. "Is this your idea?" Lena said, "I made the choice." I asked, "Why now?" She said, "I've outgrown you." Those words cut deeper than the letter. I said, "After everything?" She replied, "Exactly because of everything." I looked around. "Anyone else?" No one spoke. I said, "Fine." I signed. The pen shook. Victor smiled. I handed the paper back. "Congratulations." Lena frowned. "Don't make this harder." I said, "You already did." I walked to the door. Victor called, "Badge." I placed it on the table. Lena said softly, "I never meant to hurt you." I stopped. "You just did it better." I left the room. The hallway felt longer than ever. My phone buzzed. A message from Lena, "We'll talk later." I deleted it. At the elevator, security stood close. One guard said, "Rough day." I said, "You have no idea." The doors closed. As I went down, memories hit me. Late nights. Empty cups. Quiet promises. I remembered wiring money years ago. I remembered telling myself love mattered more. I remembered choosing silence. Outside, rain fell. I stood there holding a box. Inside were years of my life. I looked up at the building. My building. I said aloud, "You fired the wrong man." No one answered. I walked away, heartbroken, mind awake. Outside the lobby, Victor followed me. He said, "No hard feelings." I said, "You planned this." He shrugged. "Someone had to." I asked, "Did she know?" He smiled. "Enough." I said, "Enjoy it." He said, "I will." Lena called my name. I turned. She said, "Wait." I said, "Why?" She said, "You'll be fine." I laughed. "You sound sure." She said, "You always land softly." I asked, "Do you believe that?" She hesitated. "I believe in myself." I nodded. "That's clear." She said, "I built this company." I replied, "Did you?" Victor cut in, "This is over." I said, "For now." Lena frowned. "What does that mean?" I said, "Nothing you need." She said, "You're being dramatic." I said, "You taught me." Silence stretched. She said, "I loved you." I answered, "Past tense hurts." Victor checked his watch. Lena said, "Take care." I said, "I always do." I walked through the doors. Cold air hit me. I breathed deep. I said to myself, "Stay calm." My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered, "Hello." A voice said, "Mr. Moore?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Your assets are secure." I said, "Good." He asked, "Next steps?" I said, "Watch and wait." He said, "Understood." I ended the call. I smiled for the first time. I said softly, "The game just started." I stepped into the rain again. I felt small then steady. I said, "I trusted you." No answer came. I said, "I trusted myself once." That felt better. Cars passed. Lights blurred. I wiped my face. I said, "This isn't the end." I believed it. I walked on, silent, ready. I whispered, "Remember this day." Thunder rolled. I smiled. I said, "So will you." I kept walking, counting steps, counting breaths, promising myself I would never kneel again. That promise burned bright inside. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Lena was already there, sitting on the couch. "You're late," she said. "I was fired," I replied. She crossed her arms. You were let go. I asked, is that easier to say? She sighed. Don't start. I put my keys down. You already did. Silence filled the room. It pressed on my ears. I said, say it. She looked away. Say what? I said, why you're done with me. She stood up. I'm tired. I said, of me? She nodded. Yes. I asked, since when? She said, for a long time. I laughed softly. You never said. She snapped, you never changed. I said, I supported you. She replied, you hid. I asked, from what? She said, from ambition. That word hung between us. I said, I believed in you. She answered, belief isn't enough. I asked, is Victor enough? Her eyes flashed. Leave him out of this. I stepped closer. You defend him fast. She said, he pushes me forward. I asked, and I hold you back? She said nothing. That was my answer. I said, you're ashamed of me? She whispered, yes. My chest tightened. Because I'm quiet? She said, because you're invisible. I said, I chose that. She replied, I didn't. I asked, when did you stop loving me? She looked tired. I don't know. I nodded. That hurts more. She walked to the table and placed a folder down. What's that? I asked. She said, divorce papers. I opened it slowly. She said, I want this clean. I asked, no counseling? She said, no pretending. I read my name. Her name. I said, you planned this. She answered, I prepared. I looked up. With Victor? She said sharply, with lawyers. I smiled. Of course. My hand shook as I signed. She watched, expression flat. I asked, did any of this matter? She said, it mattered once. I signed the last page. I slid the folder back. Done. She looked surprised. That's it. I said, you wanted silence. She said, you're not even angry. I replied, I'm empty. She gathered the papers. I remembered late nights years ago. I remembered wiring money quietly. I remembered Mr. Rowan's voice. Anonymity protects love, he said. I believed him. I said to Lena, I helped you once. She frowned. Helped how? I said, never mind. She said, you always do that. I nodded. That's why this works. She picked up her bag. I asked, where will you go? She said, somewhere forward. I said, good choice. She paused. You'll be okay. I smiled. You sound sure. She said, you don't need much. That hurt more than anger. I opened the door. She hesitated. I don't regret this. I said, you will. She asked, is that a threat? I replied, a fact. She left without looking back. The door clicked shut. I stood alone. I said aloud, I won't beg. The room echoed nothing. I thought of the trust. I thought of my name hidden. I thought of love misjudged. I said, I'll watch. I sat down slowly. I added, and I'll wait. I stopped answering calls. I let people talk. They say you're finished, someone texted. I replied, maybe. Rumors spread fast. I met Mr. Rowan in his office at dusk. You look calm, he said. I sat down. I feel focused. He asked, do you want to move now? I said, not yet. He nodded. Clara is waiting. Clara entered and closed the door. She said, I'm glad you called. I asked, how bad is it? She said, Victor is reckless. I leaned back. Explain. She said, he's pushing debt. Mr. Rowan asked, without approval? She said, without understanding. I said, Lena agreed? Clara hesitated. She trusts him. I closed my eyes. That figures. Mr. Rowan said, your position remains secure. I said, remind her who owns the votes. Clara looked shocked. You want me to? I said, tell me first. She asked, are you still hidden? I said, yes. Mr. Rowan smiled. 51%. Clara whispered, you own everything. I corrected her. I own control. She said, she doesn't know? I said, she never asked. Silence followed. Clara said, Victor plans an overseas deal. I asked, risk level? She said, extreme. Mr. Rowan asked, timeline? 2 months, Clara said. I felt torn. I said, if it fails, Lena falls. Clara said, yes. I rubbed my hands. Mr. Rowan said, "You can stop it." I asked, "Should I?" Clara said, "You still care." I replied, "I remember." She said, "That's not an answer." I stood. "I won't interfere." Mr. Rowan raised an eyebrow. I said, "Let the truth breathe." Clara said, "That's dangerous." I answered, "So is trust." She asked, "Is this revenge?" I said, "No." Mr. Rowan asked, "Justice?" I said, "Balance." Clara looked uneasy. I added, "Keep watching." She nodded. "I always do." I turned to leave. Mr. Rowan said, "You're changing?" I said, "I'm waking up." Outside, my phone buzzed again. A message read, "You okay?" It was Lena. I didn't reply. I remembered her voice in court. I remembered her eyes in the boardroom. I remembered signing away my name. I whispered, "I tried." Clara called later. "Victor hired consultants," she said. I asked, "Any competent?" She laughed softly. "No." I said, "Good." She asked, "You sound relieved." I said, "I am." She paused. "This could ruin her." I answered, "She chose distance." Clara said, "And you?" I said, "I choose silence." Days passed quietly. People stopped calling. Accounts stayed stable. Mr. Rowan updated me nightly. "You're still invisible," he said. I replied, "Perfect." He asked, "Do you miss her?" I said, "I miss who I thought she was." He said, "That's human." I said, "So is learning." One evening I stood by the window. City lights blinked below. I said aloud, "I won't save you." No one answered. I added, "I won't destroy you either." That felt right. My phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. I answered, "Yes?" A voice said, "This is Victor." I smiled. He said, "We should talk." I replied, "I don't think so." He said, "You sound confident." I answered, "I am." He laughed. "You have nothing." I said, "Keep believing that." I ended the call. I sat down calmly. For the first time I chose myself. I stayed quiet while the noise grew louder. "She's slipping," Clara said on the phone. I asked, "Because of Victor?" She answered, "Because she listens to him." I said, "Tell me everything." Clara sighed. "He controls meetings now." I asked, "Lena allows it?" "She thinks he's decisive," Clara said. I smiled sadly. "She used to say that about me." Clara paused. "You still notice?" I replied, "I still remember." Reports arrived daily. I read them at night. Numbers bent in strange ways. I called Mr. Rowan. "Risk exposure is climbing," he said. I asked, "How bad?" He said, "Bad enough to kill trust." I said, "Or reveal lies." He replied, "Both." One afternoon Clara whispered, "They're pushing the overseas deal." I asked, "Without safeguards?" She said, "Victor removed them." I leaned back. "Does Lena know?" Clara said, "She signed." My chest tightened. I said, "She trusted him." Clara said, "She trusts strength." I asked, "And caution?" She said, "She calls it fear." I laughed once. Clara asked, "Is this what you wanted?" I said, "I wanted truth." She said, "Truth hurts." I replied, "So does blindness." Days later, news broke. The deal collapsed overnight. Phones rang everywhere. Clara called first. "It failed," she said. I asked, "Casualties?" She said, "Huge losses." I closed my eyes. She added, "Victor vanished." I asked, "And Lena?" Clara said, "She stepped forward." I watched the press conference online. Lena stood alone. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you approve this?" one yelled. She said, "Yes." "Who advised you?" She hesitated. "I take responsibility." I felt pride and pain collide. Mr. Rowan called. "She's protecting him," he said. I answered, "She always does." He asked, "Do you want to intervene?" I said, "Not yet." That night, rain tapped my window. My phone lit up. Lena's name appeared. I stared at it. I imagined her voice. "I need you," she would say. The phone rang again. I let it ring. It stopped. A message followed. "Please," she wrote. I typed nothing. Clara texted, "She's breaking." I replied, "I know." She asked, "How can you be so calm?" I said, "I'm not." I sat on the floor. My phone buzzed again. Lena called once more. I whispered, "Don't." The ringing stopped. I remembered nights she asked my advice. I remembered her listening then. I said aloud, "You chose him." Silence answered. Mr. Rowan called later. "Victor is hiding," he said. I asked, "For how long?" He said, "Not long." I nodded. He added, "Lena is isolated." I said, "By her own walls." He asked, "Do you regret waiting?" I thought carefully. "I regret loving blindly," I said. He replied, "That's honest." I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said, "If I answer now, nothing changes." No one argued. Outside, sirens passed. Inside, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail appeared. I didn't play it. I said softly, "This is the cost." My chest hurt. I stayed still. I let the night pass. I chose silence again. There was a knock at my door. I didn't move. Another knock followed, softer. I opened it. Lena stood there, eyes red, shoulders slumped. She said, "I had nowhere else." I stepped aside. "Come in." She walked past me slowly. "You look tired," I said. She laughed bitterly. "That's one word." We stood in silence. I asked, "What happened?" She said, "Victor lied." I nodded. She said, "He stole." I nodded again. She whispered, "He used me." I said nothing. She looked at me. "Aren't you going to say something?" I replied, "You're talking." She sat down heavily. "I defended him," she said. I asked, "Against who?" She swallowed. "Against you." I leaned on the wall. She said, "He emptied accounts." I asked, "All of them?" She said, "Enough." I nodded once. She said, "The board hates me." I replied, "They loved results." She flinched. She said, "I ruined everything." I asked, "Everything?" She said, "My name." I said, "Names survive." She looked up. "I need help." I stayed quiet. She asked, "Do you still care?" I said, "That's a hard question." She moved closer. "Please." I said, "Answer mine first." She hesitated. "What?" I asked, "If I were still useless, would you be here?" Her mouth opened. No words came out. Seconds passed. I watched her try. She finally looked down. That silence screamed. I said, "That's enough." She whispered, "It's not like that." I asked, "Then say it." She couldn't. Tears fell. She said, "I'm scared." I replied, "You weren't scared when you left." She said, "I thought I was right." I nodded. "So did I." She reached for my hand. I stepped back. She froze. "Don't," I said. She asked, "Why are you so cold?" I answered, "Because warmth cost me everything." She shook her head. "I loved you." I replied, "You loved what I gave." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Neither was the boardroom." She looked away. She said, "Victor will destroy me." I asked, "Didn't you say you built the company?" She whispered, "I thought I did." I said, "Thoughts aren't truth." She stood up. "So you won't help?" I asked, "Help how?" She said, "Fix it." I replied, "You fired the fixer." She winced. She said, "I made a mistake." I nodded. "We all do." She asked, "Can't you forgive me?" I said, "Forgiveness isn't rescue." She cried harder. I waited. She asked, "What do you want from me?" I answered, "Nothing." That broke her more. She said, "I don't recognize you." I said, "You never did." She whispered, "You're punishing me." I shook my head. "I'm stepping aside." She asked, "So I fall alone?" I replied, "You climbed alone." She wiped her face. "I trusted the wrong person," she said. I answered, "So did I." She walked to the door slowly. She stopped. "If things were different." I said, "They were." She nodded once. She opened the door. She asked, "Will you watch me fail?" I said, "I will watch the truth." She left without another word. The door closed softly. I leaned against it. My heart raced. My hand shook. I whispered, "This hurts." No one argued. I walked to the window. City lights flickered. I said, "I almost saved you." That scared me. I breathed out slowly. I said, "No more." For the first time, I chose distance. I chose clarity. I chose myself. Clara called me early. "It's happening," she said. I asked, "Now?" She replied, "Right now." I said, "I'll listen." She whispered, "Authorities are inside." I closed my eyes. "During the meeting?" Yes, she said. I pictured the room. I said, Victor is there. She answered, at the head. I smiled faintly. Mr. Rowan joined the call. Evidence is submitted, he said. I asked, clean? He replied, very. Clara said, they're standing behind him. I imagined Victor's face. I asked, what did he say? Clara said, he laughed. I said, he always does. She whispered, not anymore. I heard shuffling. Clara said, they showed the files. I asked, all of them? She said, every transfer. Mr. Rowan said, he's pale. I leaned back. Clara said, Lena just walked in. My chest tightened. I asked, does she understand? Clara said, not yet. I stayed silent. She continued, they read the charges. I asked, her reaction? She's frozen, Clara said. I breathed slowly. Mr. Rowan said, Victor is shouting. I asked, denial? He's blaming Lena, Rowan said. I shook my head. Clara said, she's standing. I asked, strong? She said, broken. I closed my eyes. I remembered her firing me there. I remembered her voice. Clara whispered, they're arresting him. I said, now? Yes, she replied. I imagined the handcuffs. I imagined the silence. Clara said, he's looking around. I asked, for allies? She said, for exits. Mr. Rowan said, there are none. I nodded. Clara said, they're escorting him out. I exhaled. She added, Lena sat down. I said nothing. Clara asked, are you okay? I said, I'm steady. She said, the board is panicking. I replied, they fear exposure. Mr. Rowan said, stock is dropping. I asked, how far? He said, fast. I said, it will recover. Clara said, not without direction. I replied, that comes later. She asked, do you want to step in now? I said, no. She said, they're calling emergency votes. I answered, let them. Mr. Rowan said, you're calm. I replied, I waited. Clara said, Lena is crying. My throat tightened. I asked, publicly? She said, only to herself. I said, that room remembers me. Clara paused. She's looking at your old seat, she said. I smiled sadly. Mr. Rowan said, history has timing. I said, so does truth. Clara said, Victor asked for you. I laughed softly. I said, too late. She asked, do you feel vindicated? I answered, I feel finished. Silence followed. Mr. Rowan said, next phase? I said, prepare disclosures. Clara said, your name? I replied, soon. She asked, as her husband? I said, as the owner. She inhaled sharply. Mr. Rowan said, majority confirmed. I said, always was. Clara said, the room is empty now. I asked, Lena? She left alone, Clara said. I nodded. I stood by the window. Traffic moved below. I said, I didn't touch him. Mr. Rowan replied, you didn't have to. I said, this isn't revenge. Clara said, then what is it? I answered, return. She said, you're reclaiming everything. I said, only what's mine. Mr. Rowan said, tomorrow changes everything. I replied, tomorrow begins it. The call ended. I stayed quiet. I whispered, this was inevitable. The city didn't answer. I felt no joy. I felt no guilt. I felt ready. I walked into the boardroom without rushing. People stopped talking. Someone whispered my name. Lena looked up. Her face drained of color. I said, good morning. No one answered. The chairman stood. Who are you? I replied, you know who I am. Victor's empty chair sat near the front. I took the seat Lena once gave me. She stared. Why are you here? I said, because this is my company. Gasps filled the room. The chairman frowned. Explain yourself. I nodded. Gladly. Lena whispered, this isn't funny. I looked at her. It never was. I slid documents forward. Mr. Rowan spoke. Ownership records. I said, 51%. Someone said, that's impossible. I replied, check the signatures. Clara stood. They're valid. The room buzzed. Lena shook her head. You lied to me. I answered, I protected us. She said, all this time? I nodded. She whispered, the funding. I said, Came from me. She covered her mouth. I continued, the trust was quiet. She asked, why hide? I replied, you asked me to. She froze. I said, you said love mattered more. Her eyes filled. A director asked, you're the owner? I said, I always was. Lena stood suddenly. You fired him, someone said. She looked around lost. I said, yes. My voice stayed calm. I added, from his own company. Silence fell hard. Lena's hands trembled. She said, I didn't know. I replied, you never wanted to. She stepped toward me. I'm sorry, she said loudly. Her voice cracked. I was wrong, she added. I met her eyes. I know, I said. She broke down then. I trusted the wrong man, she cried. I said, so did I. The chairman cleared his throat. Control transfers immediately, he said. I nodded. Clara sat beside me. Lena looked at the floor. I destroyed everything, she said. I replied, you exposed it. She asked, do you hate me? I paused. No, I said. That surprised her. She whispered, why not? I answered, because hate keeps me here. She sobbed quietly. I said, I'm taking over. The board agreed quickly. Votes were counted. Papers changed hands. Lena stayed still. I stood. This meeting is adjourned, I said. People left silently. Only Lena remained. She looked up. I'm sorry, she said again. I nodded once. I forgive you, I said. Her breath caught. But I won't return, I added. She nodded slowly. I understand, she said. I walked to the door. She called my name. I stopped. You won, she said. I replied, I reclaimed. She whispered, that hurts. I said, it ends. I left the room. My hands shook outside. Clara asked, are you okay? I said, I held the line. Mr. Rowan smiled slightly. You showed restraint, he said. I replied, that was the point. I looked back once. Lena sat alone. I felt no pride. I felt release. Months passed quietly. The company steadied without me. Clara called less. That's a good sign, she said. I replied, that was the goal. Mr. Rowan asked, any regrets? I said, only old ones. He laughed softly. One afternoon Lena asked to meet. Just once, she said. I agreed. We sat across from each other. She looked calmer, smaller. I resigned, she said. I nodded. I know. She asked, you planned that? I replied, I planned space. She took a breath. I wanted to apologize, she said. I waited. She continued, not as a CEO. I said, as what? She said, as someone who failed you. I looked at her carefully. She said, I was blind. I replied, you were certain. She flinched. She said, I confused power with worth. I nodded. She asked, do you forgive me? I paused. Yes, I said. Her eyes widened. She whispered, why? I answered, because I'm tired. She laughed weakly. I deserve anger, she said. I replied, you don't need it. She leaned forward. I miss us, she said. I said, I miss who I was. She asked, can we try again? I shook my head. No, I said gently. She swallowed. I understand, she said. I stood. She stood too. I hope you're happy, she said. I replied, I'm honest. That made her smile sadly. We walked outside together. She stopped. I never thanked you, she said. I answered, you don't have to. She nodded. We parted without touching. I walked on alone. Later I packed my office. I gave the keys back. Clara asked, you sure? I said, certain. She smiled. You changed. I replied, I chose. I left the building quietly. No cameras waited. No applause followed. That felt right. At home I sat by the window. I thought about silence. I said aloud, I lost everything. The words felt lighter now. I added, and found myself. My phone buzzed once. A message from Mr. Rowan. Proud of you, it read. I smiled. I thought about love without fear. I thought about work without masks. I thought about life without lies. I said, I don't need revenge. The room stayed quiet. I said, I needed truth. That settled something inside me. I breathed slowly. I felt steady. I felt free. I walked outside as evening fell. The city moved on. So did I.